They say drowning is peaceful, that the body gives up fighting and just floats. That's what people who've never watched someone drown tell themselves. Nora Hadley knew better. She'd watched her father go under in the Ottawa River when she was 9 years old, watched the current take him the way it takes everything, indifferently, without ceremony, without even the dignity of a dramatic last moment. Just here, then gone, the water closing smooth and flat above him like nothing had ever broken the surface at all. So when the ice cracked beneath the wheels of the red pickup truck at Morrison Lake that February night, and she heard the scream from the back seat, thin and high and absolutely certain that this was the end, Nora didn't stop to think she was already running. The cold hit her like a wall of knives. That's not dramatic language. That's the only honest thing you can say about -20 air meeting wet wool and bare skin. Every nerve in her body fired at once, screaming at her to go back, to turn around, to let the professionals handle it. But the sirens were still far away. She could hear them, distant and useless. And the truck was tilted at a 40-degree angle into the cracked ice, and the little boy's face in the rear window was turning from terrified to blank in the particular way that meant shock was already setting in. She got the door open on the third pull. She got him out. This small, serious-faced boy who didn't cry, who wrapped his arms around her neck with quiet trust like he'd already decided she was safe, and she staggered back towards solid ground with the weight of him against her chest, and the ice groaning beneath her boots, and the cold eating through her coat like it was nothing at all. Then the ice gave way completely. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from today. I'm reading every single one. The hospital ceiling was the most boring thing Nora had ever stared at, and she'd once spent 3 hours in a government waiting room with nothing but a laminated poster about workplace hand hygiene for company. Her core temperature had dropped to 32 degrees Celsius. Moderate hypothermia, the attending physician told her, which apparently meant she'd been very close to the kind of cold that doesn't let you warm back up. Her fingers were wrapped in gauze, first-degree frostbite on both hands. Nothing that wouldn't heal, but she'd know about it for a while. What she didn't know, what no one seemed willing to tell her, was whether the boy was okay. She'd asked the nurse twice. She'd asked the paramedic who'd come in to check on her. She'd asked the orderly who delivered her terrible cup of tea. They all gave her the same expression, careful, practiced, the professional blankness of people trained not to say anything that could be held against them. Finally, a doctor appeared in her doorway, young, tired-eyed, carrying a clipboard like a shield. The boy, Nora said before he could introduce himself, the child from the truck. Is he? He stepped in, closed the door. The boy is being assessed. He's stable. What does that mean? It means he's stable. He looked at his clipboard. We need to ask you some questions about tonight. What followed was 40 minutes of the strangest conversation of Nora Hadley's 29 years. 2 OPP officers, Ontario Provincial Polices, in their regulation winter parkas, looking deeply uncomfortable, sat at her bedside and told her, with careful, practiced neutrality, that the red pickup truck on Morrison Lake had been unoccupied. There was no one in the vehicle, the senior officer told her. His name was Constable Braben, according to his badge, and he had the measured tone of a man who had delivered strange news before. No adults, no child. The driver's side door was open when we arrived. Ice around the vehicle suggests it had been there for some time before it went through. I held him. Nora sat up straighter against the pillows, ignoring the ache in her hands. He was wearing a blue parka with a fur-trimmed hood. He had a red mitten on his left hand and a green mitten on his right hand, because he'd lost the mates. He smelled like maple syrup, and he was humming something. I don't know what it was, but he was humming it when I carried him out. Braben exchanged a look with his partner, Miss Hadley. Extreme cold exposure can cause. I know what hypothermia can cause. She'd been a nursing student for 2 years before her mother's illness had made that impossible to continue. I am telling you what happened. Where is the boy? There is no record of any child being brought in from Morrison Lake tonight, the second officer said. She was younger, her expression more sympathetic. The only person transported from the scene was you. They left her with a pamphlet about trauma responses and the name of a crisis line. Nora looked at the pamphlet for a long time. Then she looked at the red line around her left wrist where something, a small hand gripping hard, holding on, had left a mark that was already beginning to bruise. She hadn't imagined that. She hadn't imagined any of it. Morrison Falls was the kind of small Ontario town that closed its hardware stores at 5 and its restaurants by 9, which made the Birchwood Diner, with its vinyl booths and its 24-hour coffee and its cook named Gord, who smoked out the back between orders, the social and commercial heart of the community. Nora had worked there for 3 years. She knew every regular by name and order. She knew which booths had wobbly legs and which table near the window got a draft when the front door opened, which was often. She was back at work 4 days after the lake. Her hands still ached with the particular deep ache of cold that has gotten all the way into the bone. But her shift paid for her mother's physio appointments, and the bills did not pause for frostbite. She was refilling coffee for the Hendersons, booth 6, Wednesday regulars, always the early bird special. When the front door opened and the draft hit the back of her neck, she turned automatically to count heads for seating. The man who walked in did not belong in the Birchwood diner. That was her first clear thought. Not that he was handsome, though he was, in that specific cold-weather way, dark-featured, sharp-jawed, the kind of face that looked like it had been built for discomfort and had made peace with it. Not that he was dangerous, though something in the set of his shoulders said that too. It was simply that he was out of place in the way that certain things are obviously, immediately wrong before you can say exactly why. A wolf in a room full of dogs. He wore a dark coat, well-cut, expensive, the kind that didn't need a logo to announce itself. And 2 men followed him in that nobody had invited. One moved to the far corner booth. The other stood by the door, with his arms crossed and his eyes moving, appeared at the pass-through window, caught Nora's eye, and shrugged in a way that meant, "Your problem." The man in the coat didn't sit at the counter. He walked directly to the booth where Nora had been heading and sat down, and looked at her in a way that said he'd known exactly where she was going and had simply decided to intercept her. "Mrs. Hadley." His voice was low, accented slightly in a way she couldn't place. Something European underneath the Canadian flat. "Sit down, please." "I'm working. I know you are." He didn't move. "I'll be brief." Something in his certainty made her sit. She hated that about herself immediately. He studied her across the table with the particular attention of someone accustomed to assessing things quickly and being right about what they found. She studied him back because that was only fair. "My name is Dorian Ashcroft," he said, "and I believe you pulled my son out of Morrison Lake 4 nights ago." The coffee pot was still in Nora's hand. She set it down before she could drop it. "The police said, the police were told what I needed them to be told." He said it the way people state weather facts, not boasting, just explaining the mechanism. "Owen is 8 years old. He has a condition, spinal stenosis, very mild, but enough that certain environments are dangerous for him. He was not supposed to be anywhere near that lake. His nanny was supposed to be watching him. Something moved through his expression, something cold and absolute. That situation has been addressed. Is he okay?" Dorian Ashcroft looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a man not accustomed to being interrupted by concern for other people's feelings. "He asked about you," he said, instead of answering directly. He asked if the woman who smelled like pine trees and carried him like he wasn't heavy had come to find him yet. He paused. "Owen doesn't speak to strangers. He hasn't, in fact, spoken to anyone outside our household in approximately 14 months. His therapist calls it selective mutism following acute trauma." Nora had nothing to say to that. The bruise on her wrist from his small gripping hand was still faintly visible. "I need someone for my son," Dorian Ashcroft said. "Someone he trusts. That appears, inexplicably, to be you. I carried him across 40 meters of cracked ice." "That's not exactly a foundation for it is for Owen." He leaned forward, and the movement was the first thing he'd done that seemed human rather than strategic. "Miss Hadley, I will pay your mother's medical bills. All of them. The physiotherapy, the home care, the medication. I will pay you a salary that will make this." A brief, not unkind gesture at the diner around them. "Look like spending money. And I will put you in the safest house in Northern Ontario." Why does the safest house in Northern Ontario need to be a selling point? He didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, which were large and scarred in ways she didn't have the context for yet, and then he looked back at her. "Because someone put my son on that lake," he said quietly, "and they knew exactly when the ice would go through." He left a card on the table when he went. Heavy stock, embossed. A phone number and an address in Muskoka. No name, because men like Dorian Ashcroft apparently didn't need to label things they owned. Nora's hands were shaking when she picked it up. She told herself it was the residual cold. She gave herself 48 hours to decide, which was 36 hours longer than it actually took. The drive to the Ashcroft property took her north out of Morrison Falls on roads that got progressively quieter and more deliberately maintained, the kind of roads where the snow is cleared to a precise width and the trees along the verge have been shaped by professional hands. The car that collected her was black, understated, and driven by a man named Vickers, who answered exactly as many questions as he chose to and no more. The gate was wrought iron, operated from somewhere she couldn't see. The grounds beyond it went on longer than she expected, and then the house appeared, and Nora understood that she had been underestimating the situation since the moment Dorian Ashcroft had walked into the Birchwood diner. It wasn't a house. It was what houses aspired to be when they grew up. 3 stories of grey stone and dark timber, framed by old-growth pines that made the whole structure look like it had grown there rather than been built. Security cameras at regular intervals, tasteful and discreet, and absolutely everywhere. A perimeter she couldn't see but felt, the way you feel being watched. Dorian met her at the door. He'd shed the formal coat for something more domestic, dark trousers, a heavy wool sweater with the sleeves pushed up, revealing the edge of something inked on his left forearm. Saints or soldiers, she couldn't tell which, the lines disappearing back under the cuff before she could read them. "Owen's been up since 5, he said, by way of greeting. "He knows you're coming. Did you tell him?" He figured it out. Something almost warm in his expression, quickly contained. "He does that." Owen's room was on the 2nd floor, and it announced itself from the hallway by sound. The specific bright clatter of Lego being sorted with great seriousness, before she even reached the door. Dorian knocked, which struck her, and waited. "Come in," said a voice so small and deliberate it made her chest ache. The room was controlled chaos in the best possible sense. Maps pinned to the walls, real maps, hand-annotated in red pen, the kind her father used to keep in the car. A terrarium along one windowsill, empty for winter but carefully labeled. Books stacked in a system that probably made sense to Owen and no one else. And in the center of it, cross-legged on a floor cushion with a half-built Lego frigate in his lap, a small boy with his father's dark hair, and a face like a question no one had answered yet. He looked up. Whatever reserve he'd been wearing fell off in an instant, just. Gone the way a child's carefully practiced stoicism goes when something more important pushes through. "You came," he said. "I came," Nora said. "I kept thinking maybe it was a dream." He said this with the careful seriousness of a child who had had too many things turn out to be true that he'd hoped were dreams. "The lake. The lake was real." Nora crossed the room and sat on the floor beside him, because adults who stayed standing in doorways while children sat on the floor had always struck her as missing the point. And so am I. Owen looked at her for a long moment, then he handed her a Lego piece without a word, and she understood this was acceptance in the language he was currently speaking. Behind her at the door, she heard Dorian make a sound low in his throat, something wound tight, suddenly releasing, before his footsteps carried him away down the hall. The house ran itself on routines so precise they felt engraved, and Nora learned them the way you learn a new landscape, by walking it until the map is in your feet. Owen's mornings began at 7. Breakfast, always eggs, always scrambled, prepared with an earnestness that suggested eggs were a serious undertaking. Then reading, in the window seat of his room with whatever book he was currently dissecting. His current project was a hardback history of the Canadian fur trade, which he was annotating in the margins with questions in small, precise handwriting. He didn't have a tutor currently. That Dorian explained in their first real conversation, conducted in his office on the 3rd floor, which had the quality of a place where serious things happened, was one of the things that needed addressing. "The last one left," Dorian said. It was not an explanation so much as a statement of a recurring event. "How many have there been?" 3, since October. He wasn't looking at her. His attention was on the papers in front of him, though she had the sense he wasn't reading them. "Owen is not an easy child to teach. Owen is a child who reads Canadian economic history for fun," Nora said. "I think the problem might have been the tutors." Dorian looked up at her then. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, grey, the color of the lake in February, had something in them she hadn't expected. Not quite surprise, something closer to reassessment. "You have no formal childcare credentials," he said. "I have 2 years of nursing school, and 3 years of talking to every kind of person who comes through a small-town diner. I've managed worse than a curious 8-year-old. A long pause, then unexpectedly. "He asked me last night if you were staying." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was up to you." Another pause. "You are the first person he has asked that about." Nora looked at the man across the desk from her. This controlled, careful man with the scarred hands and the soldiers or saints on his arm, and the weight of something she didn't yet understand sitting on his shoulders like weather, and thought that he might be the loneliest person she had ever been in a room with. Not the obvious loneliness of isolation. The specific loneliness of someone who had chosen danger over softness so many times that he'd forgotten softness was a real option. "I'm staying," she said. She made Owen pancakes that Sunday morning, sourdough, because he'd mentioned he didn't like the taste of baking powder, a fact she filed alongside dozens of others in the mental index she was building of Owen Ashcroft's world. He ate 2.5 and declared the remaining half a structural element of the breakfast arrangement, which Nora accepted as a reasonable artistic decision. They were washing up when the housekeeper, a compact, efficient Quebecoise woman named Mrs. Arcand, appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone bracing for an argument. "Mr. Ashcroft would like the boy to have his tutoring assessment this morning. Owen went still at the sink. "The gentleman has been waiting since 9, Mrs. Arkand added, directed at Nora, which meant, "This is now your problem." The gentleman was already in the sitting room, mid-50s, sweater vest, the particular harried energy of someone who had been told things would be straightforward and was now revising that assessment. He introduced himself as Mr. Blaine, educational consultant engaged to evaluate Owen's current academic level and recommend a going-forward curriculum. Owen sat in the leather chair across from Mr. Blaine and looked at the wall. "Owen," Nora said quietly, "Mr. Blaine has come a long way." Silence. Mr. Blaine tried a series of introductory questions. Grade appropriate, patient, delivered with the professional warmth of someone who worked with reluctant children regularly. Owen acknowledged none of them. He had retreated to whatever interior space he went to when the world outside became less interesting than the one inside, and the particular quality of his stillness said he could maintain it indefinitely. After 45 minutes, Mr. Blaine packed up his materials with movements that expressed more than his neutral face did. "I understand this has been difficult," he said, to no one in particular. "He's not difficult," Nora said before she could think better of it. "He's disengaged. There's a difference." Mr. Blaine looked at her. "I'm afraid I can't assess what a child won't show me. What if you ask him about the fur trade?" The words came from some instinct she didn't quite examine in time to stop them, specifically the Hudson's Bay Company's shift in the 1760s. "He has opinions." The silence stretched. Owen's eyes moved to her from the wall. Just a flicker, but there. Mr. Blaine, to his credit, tried it. 40 minutes later, he was still in the chair, now leaning forward, his notes abandoned, while Owen, still not exactly making eye contact, still speaking mostly toward the middle distance, delivered a detailed and occasionally devastating analysis of colonial economic policy with the confidence of a child who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. When Mr. Blaine finally left, Dorian was standing in the doorway of the sitting room. He'd come in somewhere around the 20-minute mark, and Nora hadn't heard him arrive. "He recommended we let you design his curriculum," Dorian said. His voice was neutral, but his jaw wasn't. "I'm not a teacher," he said, "and I'm quoting, that you have a better instinct for what that child needs than anyone he's seen work with him." Dorian paused. He also left his card and said he'd be available as a resource. Owen had already returned to his room. Nora could hear the Lego through the ceiling. "You could hire an actual teacher," she said. "I could." Dorian was still looking at her with that gray-eyed, unreadable attention that she was slowly learning to read. "Or I could acknowledge when something is working and not interfere with it." He left the way he always left, without ceremony, without softening, and Nora stood alone in the sitting room and thought that the man was going to be a problem in a way she didn't yet have the vocabulary to articulate. The laundry room was off the mudroom on the ground floor, tucked past the boot rack and the outdoor equipment storage, and Nora ended up there on a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Arkand's assistant called in ill. The household ran on precision. An ill assistant meant redistributed tasks, and Nora was not too proud to sort jackets. She went through pockets the way her mother had taught her. Receipts, wrappers, the small forgotten items that lived in the margins of men's days. The security staff rotated their equipment through the mudroom regularly. She'd learned the drill. The third jacket had a phone in the inside pocket. Not unusual, except that the phone wasn't locked and it lit up as she moved it, not with a notification, but because someone was actively, at that moment, using it as a listening device. She could see the app running. She could see the timer, 47 minutes active. Nora set the jacket down carefully. She looked at the phone. She photographed the screen with her own phone before she could second-guess herself, photographed the jacket, the hook it had come from, the number on the rack, rack 7. That was Hendrix's position. The youngest of the security staff, mid-20s, always pleasant, always just a fraction too interested in Owen's schedule. She put the listening device back in the pocket. She returned the jacket to the rack. She went back to the kitchen and made Owen an after-school snack and sat across from him while he told her about a book he'd found in the library. Something about Arctic exploration. And she listened with the part of her that could do that, while the rest of her turned over possibilities with careful, clinical hands. Someone had been listening. Someone had known about Morrison Lake. She needed more than one photograph before she brought this to Dorian Ashcroft, because she was 3 weeks into this job, and he barely trusted her with the laundry. That night she lay awake in her room, generous, warm, facing the pines, and listened to the sound of the property settling around her, the distant movement of the overnight patrol, the way security lights shifted through her curtains when someone passed. She thought about the lake, the ice, the cold. She thought about a small boy's complete and uncomplicated trust in a stranger. Someone had put him out there to die. and she was living in the same house as whoever had told them where to look. She found Dorian in his office at 11:10, which she already knew was not late for him. He worked in the hours after Owen went to bed with the discipline of someone who had spent years restructuring what counted as sleep. The door was open. She knocked anyway. He looked up with the alertness of a man who'd survived by never being caught unarmed, and then, seeing her, something in his expression shifted from threat assessment to something else. Something she couldn't name yet, Mrs. Hadley. A pause. It's late. I know. She stepped inside, closed the door. I found something today in the laundry. She showed him the photographs. The silence that followed was the kind that has temperature. This one was cold. Hendricks, Dorian said. Just the name. A statement, not a question. I didn't know what to do with one piece of evidence. She kept her voice steady. I thought you'd ask me how I was sure. I thought you'd tell me I'd been here 3 weeks and didn't know who to trust. He set her phone down with precise care. Is that what you thought? Isn't that what you'd say? He looked at her for a long time. The desk lamp put half his face in shadow, and she could see more of the tattoo above his collar than usual. The edge of a wing, the suggestion of something larger and darker beneath the wool. Hendricks has been with us for 8 months, Dorian said. He was referred through a channel I thought I could trust. A pause. The channel has been wrong before. Someone arranged the lake. I know. He said it with a quietness that hit differently than anger would have. I know, Miss Hadley. I've known there was someone inside. I haven't been able to identify the source. But now I can. His eyes met hers, and the grey in them was the grey of deep water, not shallow water, not the cold surface. Something underneath. You could have confronted him. You could have gone to Mrs. Arkand. You came to me. You're his father. Something crossed his face, just for a second. The kind of thing a controlled man allows himself when he thinks no one is measuring. Thank you, he said, and it was the most unguarded thing she'd heard from him. She got up to leave. At the door, his voice stopped her. Mrs. Hadley. She turned. He was looking at the photographs again, but he said, Owen has started leaving his door open at night. He never did that before. She didn't know what to do with that, so she said goodnight and went back to her room and lay in the dark thinking about a little boy who had started sleeping with his door open because he knew someone was in the hall. She didn't sleep. She was still awake at 2 a.m. when she heard the sound. Not a footstep, something subtler, the particular quality of silence that follows movement rather than preceding it. The house breathed differently when someone was trying to be invisible in it. Nora was out of bed before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Owen's door was closed. It should have been open. She pushed through it without knocking. Hendricks was inside. He was standing by the window with Owen's tablet in his hand, and Owen was awake in bed, very still, with the careful stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is sometimes the safest option. His eyes found Nora's across the room, and the relief in them was the most devastating thing she'd ever seen. Mrs. Hadley. Hendricks's voice was flat, controlled. The pleasantness had gone somewhere that pleasantness doesn't come back from. You should go back to your room. Put the tablet down. This isn't. I said, put it down. He looked at her with the particular assessment of a man deciding whether she was a problem or an inconvenience. She was wearing pajamas and holding nothing more threatening than a borrowed flashlight from the nightstand drawer, and she was very aware of both of these things. But she was also standing between him and Owen, and she had done that before on cracking ice in the dark, and she had learned something about herself that night. She didn't move. There's nothing you can do, Hendricks said. He wants the boy. He's always going to want the boy. You can't stay in the way forever. Nora said, I need the next 4 minutes. She threw the flashlight at the window. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the right move by any tactical standard. But the window shattered with a sound like a gunshot. The cold air came flooding in, and the alarm, the one wired into every ground floor window, screamed to life, and in the chaos of the next 30 seconds, Owen rolled out of bed and got himself under it with the speed of a child who had been quietly planning an escape route. Hendricks went for the door and found Dorian Ashcroft already in it, and Nora sat down heavily on the floor of Owen's room because her legs had decided they were done. It was over quickly, the way these things are. Not cleanly, not without cost, but quickly. 2 of the security staff that Dorian had called on the drive back from the city. He'd turned around the moment she'd sent him the photographs. She found out later, hadn't made it to his meeting at all. Secured Hendricks in the time it took Nora to get back to her feet. Dorian came to her first. Not to Hendricks, restrained and silent by the far wall. Not to the security staff, ready for instruction. To her, crouched in the wreckage of Owen's window, hauling herself upright with one hand on the windowsill. Are you hurt? I'm fine. Your hands. I'm fine. She straightened. The cold coming through the broken window was considerable, and she was in thin pajamas, but she couldn't feel it yet. She suspected she was going to feel it very much in approximately 20 minutes. Owen's under the bed. Dorian crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside the bed. Bud, it's over. Come out. A pause. Then Owen's dark head appeared from under the bed frame, assessed the situation with the particular thoroughness of a child who did not take anything on faith, and then very deliberately crawled out and put his arms around his father's neck. Dorian closed his eyes. His arms went around his son with the kind of desperate, precise care of someone holding something they had almost lost. Nora looked away. Some things were private. The question that had started in the library 3 weeks later, when the Muskoka property had settled back into something approximating routine, when the security staff had been reorganized, and Hendricks was no longer a problem anyone was going to have, and when Owen had started asking Nora to read the last chapter of whatever book they were working through aloud because he liked the way she did different voices. Was this who had hired him? Dorian was working on it. She could see that from the controlled fury that lived just below the surface of his days, the phone calls that stopped when she passed his office, the meetings she didn't have the clearance for. He was pulling at threads following the money, doing the careful, brutal work of a man dismantling a betrayal. She thought about asking. She thought about not asking. She thought about the careful triangulation of her position, Owen's caregiver, Dorian's employee, something she didn't have a category for yet, and decided that asking was within her rights. His brother, Dorian told her, one evening in early April, when the pines had started to go that particular shade of green that meant winter was actually finishing. They were on the back terrace, Owen inside with a book, the property quiet in the way that felt different from held breath quiet. My brother. Half-brother. We shared a father and very little else. Ashcroft. Isn't his name our father had other families? He said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness would have been. He's been contesting my father's estate for 4 years. Owen is my heir. Without Owen, everything goes to him. A significant portion. Enough. Dorian looked at his hands on the terrace railing. He found Hendricks through a mutual contact, paid him to monitor Owen's movements to arrange what looked like an accident. A pause. He didn't account for a diner waitress with a heroic streak and a very poor sense of self-preservation. That's a flattering way to put it. It's accurate. He turned to look at her, and the spring evening light was different from the winter light she'd known him in. It was gentler. It showed things that February hadn't. You saved his life twice. The second time I just threw a flashlight, Nora. He said her first name without seeming to notice he'd done it, and then seemed to notice and didn't take it back. I brought you here because Owen trusted you. I kept you here because you were good for him. I am not good at explaining the other reason. The terrace was quiet. Somewhere in the trees, something moved. A bird settling for the night, probably. The pines smelled cold and green. Try, she said. When I walked into Owen's room that night and you were standing between him and someone with a gun, with a flashlight, he stopped. Started again. I have spent 8 years protecting that boy. I've hired security, built systems, structured everything I do around keeping him safe. And there was a woman in her pajamas with a flashlight who'd already done more than all of it. The alarm did most of the work. Nora. The word had weight this time. I'm trying to tell you something. She looked at him. He looked at her. The controlled, careful man who had built a fortress around his son and called it love, who wore soldiers and saints on his skin like a confession, who had knocked on his own son's door before entering. That man was looking at her like she was the most disorienting thing that had ever happened to him. I know what you're trying to tell me, she said. Is it yes? She said. Obviously yes. He laughed. It was short and surprised and entirely unguarded, and it was the best thing she'd heard from him. 6 months later, the property in Muskoka was recognizably the same house, and almost entirely different in the ways that mattered. Owen had expanded his room into the one adjacent, which was now a library/map room/general repository of enthusiasms, with every surface testifying to some new obsession. Arctic exploration, wetland ecology, the history of Canadian railway construction. He was working with 2 tutors now, both of whom had been specifically selected for the quality of their answers to Owen's follow-up questions, and he spoke to both of them in complete sentences. He spoke to most people now, in the careful, precise way that was simply how he was. Not a symptom of anything, just Owen. He spoke to his therapist about the lake. He drew a picture of it once and gave it to Nora, a small figure in a blue parka, and a woman in a red coat, and the ice around them in careful grey pencil. He wrote her name in the corner in block letters. She'd framed it. Dorian had stepped back from the business. The legitimate construction and property development business. The thing his family name had been built into over 3 generations. Far enough to be present for dinners, for the bedtime reading rotation, for the Sunday morning scrambled eggs that had become something close to a ritual. He was still controlled. He was always going to be controlled. But the weight on his shoulders had redistributed itself into something he seemed to be carrying by choice rather than by necessity. His half-brother's legal challenges had collapsed in February, quietly and completely, in ways that Nora didn't ask about and Dorian didn't volunteer. Some things were handled in language she didn't speak, and she was coming to peace with that. She found Dorian one Saturday afternoon at the water's edge. They had a lake too, a small one entirely on the property, with dock access and the kind of utter stillness that only exists in places where humans haven't been loud enough or long enough to disturb it. Owen was up at the house, currently in what he called his research phase, for a project about migratory patterns of snow geese, which would probably result in a handwritten report of more pages than most school projects Nora had ever seen. Dorian was sitting on the dock with his sleeves rolled up, the full extent of the tattoos visible in the afternoon light. Saints and something older. Soldiers, she could see now. Men with rifles and heavy coats, frozen in postures she recognized as the Great War, detailed enough to be specific people. Your grandfather, she guessed. Great-grandfather. He looked at the inside of his forearm. He came to Canada in 1921, from somewhere that didn't exist anymore by the time he got here. A pause. My father had them finished, as a reminder of where we came from, that you survived things. He looked up at her. Come sit. She sat beside him on the dock, their feet above the water, the afternoon light doing its complicated work on the lake surface. It was almost the same water, almost the same quality of cold waiting underneath, but the dock was solid and the ice was gone and it was only April, but it felt like something finished. I have been thinking, Dorian said, with the particular deliberateness of a man who does not say things without having thought about them for longer than anyone else would consider necessary, about what permanence looks like. Nora watched a Canada goose cut a perfect V in the water 30 meters out. And, she said, he reached into his jacket pocket, the good jacket, not the cold-weather utility coat, which meant he'd worn it for a reason, and set something small on the dock between them, a ring, simple, substantial white gold, with a stone that caught the light the way ice caught light. Not cold so far as it looked, but not warm either. Something in between. Something honest. Owen helped me choose it, Dorian said. He said you'd want something that looked like it had been around for a while. Nora looked at the ring. She looked at the man beside her. This impossible, infuriating, gradually becoming necessary man. She looked at the lake and the pines, and the late afternoon light doing its best against a sky that was already starting to think about winter again. And she thought about all the things that had led her to this dock. A truck. A scream, cracking ice and 40 meters of it between her and anything solid. Sometimes you ran toward danger because you had no choice. Sometimes you stayed because it had turned into home. Yes, she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, which should not have surprised her. He was a man who measured twice before cutting once and never needed to cut twice. And then his forehead came down against hers, and she felt him breathe, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Owen came running down the dock 20 minutes later, having apparently concluded that the research phase could wait. Is it done? He demanded, looking between them with the focused energy of a child who has been in on a secret and is very close to the limits of his self-control. Did she say yes? She said yes, Dorian said. Owen sat down on Nora's other side with a decisive thump, looked at the ring, and then looked at the lake with the expression of someone crossing an item off a very long internal list. Good, he said. I told him you would. He didn't believe me. I believed you, Dorian said. You asked me 4 times if I was sure. Owen picked up a pebble from the dock and considered it. That's not believing. Nora laughed, and the sound went out over the water and came back changed, bigger, warmer, something the lake hadn't held before. They sat there together while the light went gold and then amber, and then the particular clear dark that comes to northern Ontario in spring before the warmth fully arrives. A man who had built everything around protecting the people he loved. A boy who had decided to trust a stranger with both hands and no hesitation, and a woman who had learned, once, on a night that should have broken her, that running toward the thing that scares you is the only way to find out what's on the other side. It wasn't a perfect life. It was going to be complicated. The business, the name, the history written on skin and stone and water. There would be nights Nora looked at the lake from her window and felt the cold of it still in her bones. But Owen was beside her on the dock, and Dorian's hand was in hers, and the ice was gone, and she was home.